There's this very big country right here in Northeast Africa, just along the coast of the Red Sea. It has suddenly become super important for some obvious reasons. It is Monday, November 16, 2020. Russia's President Vladimir Putin is in a strategic meeting when he suddenly gives the green light for Russia's representatives to sign a deal with Sudan to establish a naval base capable of hosting 300 personnel and 4 warships right here on Sudan's Red Sea coast. This would be Russia's first military base in Africa, which raised a lot of suspicions, especially from the anti-Russia media that wants the West to, quote, protect Africa from Putin. But why is this important? You see, Sudan, a country in Northeast Africa, has been struggling with wars, hunger, and political instability for years now. But at the same time, the country remains very important to superpowers because of its strategic location along this shipping route. Sudan's coastal city, Port Sudan, sits just right in the middle of this very strategic zone, making it a very valuable asset for any nation seeking to control key shipping lanes. However, Russia is not here for trade, not officially, no. According to the signed agreements, the project is a simple supply and maintenance base for Russian warships, which of course is another way of saying Russia is here to use this base as one way to help project its military presence in the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. The base could accommodate up to 4 warships simultaneously, including nuclear-powered vessels and up to 300 military and civilian personnel. There's also provision for the guards who will provide security for the site. According to the draft agreement, Sudan will grant the land to Russia for 25 years, which is renewable for another 10 years without any financial compensation. Russia will also be granted the right to import arms and military equipment necessary for the operation of its base via Sudanese airports and ports without the local authorities being able to control the cargo. But what does Sudan get in return? Moscow promised to grant free assistance to the Sudanese Navy for search and rescue or, quote, anti-sabotage missions. Sudan will also be able to benefit from the protection of Russian defense systems installed on this site. While many continue to raise alarms as to Putin's real objective in this strategically located nation, I'm here to point out that this is not a Russian thing, and Sudan is not the only country being invaded either. Here is a map showing foreign military bases in Africa. There are a lot of them, especially bases belonging to these two guys who are usually doing empire stuff around the world. If you look closely at this map, you will see one particular country playing host to lots of military bases in a not so secure region of Africa. And then you begin to wonder how many of these bases exist in Africa. Why are world powers racing to stamp their military footprints on the continent of Africa at the same time that extremism and insecurity seem to be rising in the region? What is really going on? Let's start with the strategic foreign military bases in Africa. A few years ago, in the northeastern part of Nigeria, Africa's most populous nation and one of its largest economies, a war was raging against a terrorist group called Boko Haram. This terrorist group left trails of their destruction across Nigeria and beyond, and their rise to prominence turned the country into a war zone, destroying cities and villages on their path. But this group was not only causing havoc in Nigeria, they were moving through neighboring countries like Niger, Cameroon, Chad, and Benin Republic, making their presence known in the process. As their destruction continued, international communities watched closely, particularly world powers like the United States and the United Kingdom, and of course France, all looking for ways to intervene. But unlike some other African countries where the US have established permanent military bases, Nigeria has remained an exception. The US have long maintained a presence in Nigeria, offering military support when necessary. However, they have no military base in this country. So, to support Nigeria in its fight, the US provided military aid in the form of training programs, advisory missions, and joint military operations aimed at stopping this terrorist group. But as the struggle against terrorism and insecurity in the Sahel region continued to grow, these world powers were forced to rethink their strategies, particularly in neighboring regions like Niger, where these terrorist groups were said to have emerged. Across Nigeria's northern border lies Niger, a country that has become a hotbed of military activity in the face of rising wave of terrorism. Niger's geographical location in the Sahel region was recognized by the US, who took keen interest in these strategic points. To combat this regional threat posed by Boko Haram fighters and other insurgent groups, the US completed its largest drone base in Africa in 2019, costing about $110 million. A key base for launching surveillance missions to track terrorist groups such as Boko Haram fighters moving through these countries. But Airbase 201 was not the only military base stationed in Niger. In fact, the US had maintained its military presence in Niger since 2013, operating a smaller base in the capital Niamey called Airbase 101. However, this new facility in Agadez symbolized a more significant commitment to the region. So, with about 1,100 troops stationed between the two military bases, Niger became a front line in America's global fight against terrorism as surveillance drones launched from Agadez traveled the skies over Mali, Chad, and of course Nigeria, providing crucial intelligence on terrorist movements, arms smugglers, and human traffickers. Niger's key position in the Sahel made it an indispensable player in the fight against terrorism. Then, something happened. The stable democracy of Niger collapsed as the people revolted against the French-backed government. The military coup that removed the Western-backed president of Niger, whom many of his people considered a sellout and a puppet of the West, destroyed the relationship forged between the African country and the United States. Recent reports reveal that the Americans have since withdrawn their troops and left the over $100 million military base as ordered by the Nigerian government. And if we move to the east of Nigeria, there is Cameroon, a country in Central Africa deeply affected by the rise of insurgents. In 2015, the US under Barack Obama established a drone base in Garoua, a city in northern Cameroon, as part of its military efforts to combat Boko Haram. This was after the Obama White House's refusal to sell weapons to the Nigerian military during the administration of President Goodluck Jonathan. But as soon as a US-supported administration gained power in Abuja, Washington had no issues negotiating a deal with their ally Bela in Cameroon to establish a drone base right in his country. France also maintains its military presence in Cameroon with bases in the capital Yaoundé and the coastal city of Douala, the country's major port city. Other countries with bases in Cameroon are China, Germany, and the United Nations, as Bela runs some sort of a free-for-all operations in the Central African country. And if we move further to the east, thousands of miles from Nigeria is Kenya. Kenya has played critical roles in counter-terrorism efforts in East Africa, hosting foreign military bases from both the United States and the United Kingdom. The British Army Training Unit in Nanyuki, Batuk, provides a location for British troops to conduct joint exercises with Kenyan forces. It also serves as a strategic base for UK interest in East Africa, which is an official way of saying it is the location from where British officials exercise their control over resources from East Africa. The US has also maintained its own military base at Manda Bay, located in Kenya's Indian Ocean coastline. From here, US forces launch operations particularly in counter-terrorism efforts against groups like Al-Shabaab, the Somali-based terrorist group that have wreaked havoc across East Africa. And while Ghana has not been a hot zone for terrorist attacks, it has its own strategic significance. In 2018, Ghana and the United States signed a defense cooperation agreement that allowed the US military greater access to Ghanaian military facilities, particularly in the capital, Accra, which marked a new phase in US-Ghanaian military relations. The Ghanaian government, led by President Nana Akufo-Addo, assured the public that no US military base would be established on Ghanaian soil. Well, that promise did not materialize, as the status of focus agreement was eventually signed. Then if you move to Chad, foreign military bases have become common sight as the country's strategic position in the Sahel made it an ideal location for foreign military operations. The French military base here is located in N'Djamena, Chad's capital, and serves as a key hub for Operation Barkhane, a French-led initiative aimed at combating extremist groups in the region. This base supports both air and ground operations. The United States also has its military operations in Chad, primarily focused on drone operations. US forces used their base in N'Djamena to launch surveillance missions, gathering intelligence on terrorist movements across the region. Just like Niger, Chad had become an indispensable ally in the fight against extremism in the Sahel. Then, moving west to Côte d'Ivoire, France has maintained a military base in Port Bouet, near the commercial capital Abidjan. This base serves as a forward operating base for French forces conducting operations across West Africa. With its proximity to key regional hotspots, Côte d'Ivoire plays a vital role in France's military strategy in the region. Now, when you take a step back to view the full picture, one thing becomes clear. Africa, particularly this Sahel region, has become a battleground not just for terrorist activities now, but also for this fierce competition by world powers seeking to extend their influence. We have the US, UK, France, Russia, and even China all establishing military bases in Africa. So now that we know who and where they are located, the question then becomes, what is driving these foreign powers to Africa? The lazy answer to that is, of course, to fight terrorism. But is that all? Right now, at least 13 foreign powers have a substantial military presence in Africa. They are not just here to visit or shake hands with the government. They are setting up military bases, and the US and France are at the forefront of conducting these operations on African soil. While they will want to convince the African people that they are here to fight insecurity, we need to understand how some of these insecurities in the region started in the first place. For that, let's go back to 2011 in Libya, where it all began.
What we've done, what we plan to do.
NATO, which is led by the US forces in Libya, launched a military intervention there, hoping to take down Gaddafi and restore stability in Libya. But it didn't go as planned, as Libya went from an authoritarian stability under Gaddafi to absolute chaos. Even though Hillary Clinton, the then US Secretary of State, will have you believe that the mission was a success.
Yes, we came, we saw, he died.
Muammar Gaddafi's fall from power created an opportunity for armed groups to infiltrate neighboring countries, especially across the Sahel's fragile borders. Remember, the United States and its allies had armed fighters in Libya to take down their own government. Those arms were not retrieved after the fall of Gaddafi. The Sahel region of Africa became a battleground crawling with different terrorist groups and armed gangs. Militant groups in the region now used the rising conflict and instability as an opportunity to recruit fighters and spread violence across porous borders. Countries like Mali, Niger, Chad, Burkina Faso were already dealing with internal challenges at the time, but they were now faced with killings from the jihadist movements as well as armed militias. The region became very unstable, and groups like Boko Haram started exploiting this instability, and it seemed like this conflict was never going to end. How can I forget the activities of ISIS in the region? That too became a huge concern for the emergency lovers of Africa. It wasn't long before world powers like the United States and France got involved, using their military to, quote, restore peace and order in the region. Now, let's talk about one of the most concerned world powers that has been fighting for the salvation of Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce you to our savior, France. France's relationship with Africa is kind of like a complicated one. Having colonized much of West Africa, France's influence continues to grow, especially in the Sahel and West African region, where instability of these regions seemed to threaten France's economic and strategic interest. After the NATO intervention in Libya, France expanded its military footprint across the Sahel, setting up or expanding bases in countries like Mali, Niger, and Chad. The Sahel was going up in flames, and France took it upon itself to be the fire extinguisher, primarily because of its economic interest in the region. In 2014, France set up the G5 Sahel, a military arrangement that included Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger to combat terrorism in this region. And Mali, a country torn apart by extremism, became a major center for France's military efforts. This was because of something troubling that was happening in Mali 2 years prior. You see, in 2012, Mali's northern region saw a rapid increase of dangerous alliances of rebel groups capturing towns in the north. Things went from bad to worse as the northern crisis escalated very fast, threatening the stability of the entire Sahel region. The Malian government was overwhelmed with the crisis and called out to international powers for help. This call was quickly answered by the French government, who came running to save the day. Remember, Mali was once part of the French colony before they gained independence in 1960, so it was only normal that they provided help, right? French forces then began to set up a base in Gao, a strategic town in northern Mali, from where they conducted counter-terrorism operations. It seemed like France was playing the hero in a horror movie. But was that really the case though? You see, France's intervention in Mali was commendable, but not everyone was happy with this former colonial master. Many Malians began to question the real motive with France's presence in the country. They saw its intervention in the country as a form of new colonialism. You see, in 2019, a report had emerged that the French army had failed to prevent mafia-like groups from taking control of the northeastern region of Kidal, which has an immense gold reserves, by the way. The French military also turned a blind eye as the Malian government lost its grip on the equally resource-rich neighboring region of Timbuktu. So, while the French wanted the whole world to believe that they were in Mali, fighting and working to protect the unity and territorial integrity of the country, facts on the ground say otherwise. Interestingly, France's interest in the entire Sahel region was not just about stopping the atrocities committed by these terrorist groups. It was far more than that. For decades, France had profited from its involvement with the extraction of natural resources, especially uranium in neighboring Niger, a very critical resource in the production of nuclear energy. In fact, the energy consumed in France was largely dependent on the uranium mines in Niger. Niger, being one of the world's largest uranium producers, was destabilized with terrorist activities. So, in order to keep having access to these resources that France obviously relied on, it had to stop these jihadist groups in the Sahel region from gaining control over the country and jeopardizing its economic benefits. Same way, some Malians felt that France was more interested in securing its resources and strategic interests than genuinely helping Mali achieve peace and stability. Soon enough, protests erupted in Bamako in 2020, where citizens demanded that French troops leave their country. They felt France's presence, rather than offering a long-term solution, was overshadowing the Malian government's ability to develop its own military and govern effectively. But the situation wasn't that simple. It's never that simple when it comes to geopolitics. The Malian government was left in a very difficult position as they were relying on French support for security, but also facing a population that was increasingly hostile to foreign intervention. France too was at a crossroad. Leaving Mali could mean abandoning the country to extremist groups, but staying risked making France an enemy in the eyes of many Malians. Eventually, in February 2022, the French government started to withdraw their troops from Mali, moving them into neighboring Niger. With the French troops gone, Mali needed new partners and started looking elsewhere for help. And soon enough, they turned to Russia. Niger would soon follow in the example of Mali and expelled the French troops from their soil. In other words, France in Africa has been a story of what I ordered versus what I got. Now, let's talk about France's partner in crime, the United States. You see, no other military force in the world matches that of the United States, which spends more on its military budget than the next 11 countries combined. China, which follows the US in military spending, disburses only a third of what the US spends per year. According to various sources, including the Pentagon's own maps, there are at least 29 US military bases in Africa. In 2007, the US Department of Defense created the African Command, or AFRICOM, to oversee military operations across the continent. Niger, despite being one of the poorest countries in the world, became a key player in this operation. The US built an enormous drone base in Agadez, Niger, where drones flew over the Sahel, gathering intelligence and conducting targeted strikes against militant groups like Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda. The Agadez Air Base 201 became the most prominent symbol of the US military involvement in Africa. This facility allowed the US to monitor and conduct counter-terrorism operations across the region. This base was strategically positioned to cover a large area including Nigeria, Cameroon, Chad, and Mali. The US presence in Africa was not just limited to Niger, however. By 2019, AFRICOM reported having military facilities in at least 15 African countries, with around 29 known bases spread across the continent. Some of these bases were enduring footprints, meaning permanent military installations, while others were, quote, lily pads, that is temporary or semi-permanent bases, used for specific missions alone. And now that we have looked at France and the United States, what about China? The presence of foreign military forces in Africa is not just limited to the Western powers. China has been particularly active with its military presence in the Horn of Africa. The Asian giants became more engaged since 2008 when it participated in the multinational anti-piracy mission in the Gulf of Aden. China has likely considered 13 countries for military basing assets, including Angola, Kenya, the Seychelles, and Tanzania, as well as Cambodia and the United Arab Emirates. But beyond military bases, China has poured billions of dollars into economic development across Africa through its Belt and Road Initiative, investing heavily in infrastructural projects such as roads, ports, railways, aimed at developing new trade routes that bring development to Africa as well. This infrastructural strategy of China made its way to a small but oil-rich country in the west coast of Africa, where China was eyeing a naval base on the Atlantic Ocean. With a population of just over 1.5 million people, Equatorial Guinea boasts of the highest GDP per capita in mainland Africa, thanks to over 1 billion barrels of crude oil reserves discovered in the 90s. But this wealth has not benefited most of its citizens, as the country ranks among the most corrupt globally, according to Transparency International. President Teodoro Obiang Nguema has ruled the country for over 40 years, facing accusations of human rights abuses and charges of embezzlement by him and his family. Initially, American oil companies dominated oil exploration and production in the country, but over the years, China has become the country's primary partner, particularly in infrastructure development. In 2006, China's Exim Bank agreed to finance a $2 billion oil-backed project to expand the port of Bata, aiming to transform it into a modern deep-sea port. By 2019, the new Bata seaport was inaugurated, signaling a shift in China's relationship with Equatorial Guinea. But this kind gesture from China was not just for free. It came with a lot of strings attached. Equatorial Guinea's economy, which is tied closely to oil, was struggling due to falling oil prices, corruption and financial mismanagement, making it harder for the government to pay back loans, and in the process became extremely indebted to China. By 2021, the debt to China represented almost half of the country's GDP, leaving the country financially dependent on China. China's assistance during the COVID-19 pandemic through vaccine donations and sales reinforced its role as a reliable partner when others appeared absent. The US, being concerned about China's growing influence in West Africa, made an 11th-hour attempt to address security concerns. The US sent a high-level official to discuss maritime security, hoping to sway Equatorial Guinea away from allowing a Chinese military presence. But it was a little too late, as plans were already set in motion. For China, establishing a military base in Equatorial Guinea's Bata port would be very strategic, providing China access to the Atlantic Ocean, a valuable asset for a nation looking to secure its global maritime trade routes and counterbalance Western naval influence in the process. Equatorial Guinea, on the other hand, gained the security of a powerful ally at a time when the security of Obiang's regime might be tested due to corruption allegations and international scrutiny, particularly around his son, who is also the vice president, Teodoro Nguema Obiang, who had faced corruption convictions in France with asset freezes and travel bans from the UK. Now, while all these African countries host foreign military to some degree, there's one particular country in Africa which is the most desirable for these superpowers, and the question is why? There's this small arid East African country located in the Horn of Africa where these superpowers are suddenly rushing to build their military base. This country is called Djibouti. Djibouti is strategically located along one of the world's busiest shipping routes on the Bab al-Mandab Strait, which serves as the gateway from the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden and the Indian Ocean. It also provides a vital port for its landlocked neighbor, Ethiopia. Through these waters flows about 25% of the world's goods. This means having control over this strategic choke point means you have significant control over part of the world's economy, which is why world powers like the United States, France, China, and Japan all have their military bases here. But these countries are not just hosting their bases in Djibouti free of charge. The presence of these bases provides some form of economic benefits to Djibouti. Each year, these foreign powers pay millions of dollars as rent to this small country to lease their land for them, funds that are very critical to Djibouti's poor economy. Djibouti is a country with limited resources and heavily relies on these foreign powers for its revenue. With the fierce competition going on between these foreign powers, Djibouti's president, Mr. Ismail Omar, who has been in power since 1999, has somehow managed to balance the country's relationship with these foreign powers. It's also good to add that the country's proximity to unstable countries in Africa and the Middle East has also made it a significant location for foreign military powers. To the southeast lies Somalia, a country that has been a hotbed for terrorist activities where sea pirates wait to hijack ships and Al-Shabaab militants pose serious threats to the stability of the region. The constant unrest in Somalia and Yemen's war has attracted the attention of these world powers, as keeping the peace in this region is very critical for the entire world, as vital shipping lanes and trade routes run through these waters. As a former colonial power, France has maintained its military presence even after Djibouti gained independence in 1977. The former colonial power hosts about 1,500 troops, its largest military overseas base. Djibouti hosts the largest American permanent military base in Africa, Camp Lemonnier, which is home of more than 4,000 personnel. In 2017, China opened its first overseas military base in Djibouti, 10 kilometers from the US base, Camp Lemonnier. China's agreement with Djibouti ensures its military presence in the country up until 2026, with a contingent of up to 10,000 soldiers. The Chinese government has invested heavily in Djibouti's infrastructure, including a railway linking Djibouti to Ethiopia and several port facilities. These investments have boosted Djibouti's economy in the process. The Italians also have their own base, while troops from Germany and Spain are hosted by the French. So yeah, this is perhaps the most important country in Africa, at least to international trade. The presence of foreign military bases across Africa has been justified time and time again as a way of countering the activities of terrorist groups and to bring about stability in this part of the world. But is this really the case for many African countries? Many African nations are now questioning the benefits of these bases, given that the security and economic conditions in some regions have not improved under the Western influence. The AU is also concerned about its inability to monitor the movement of weapons to and from these military bases. In 2022, Mali, like we said earlier, ordered French troops to leave, with the Malian government accusing France of failing to improve security and alleged interference in its internal politics. And in early 2023, Burkina Faso followed Mali's lead by demanding that France withdraw its military forces. This decision came amid public protests against French influence, reflecting a sentiment of national sovereignty and frustration over France's perceived failure to combat jihadist insurgency. Following a coup in 2023, Niger's new military leadership demanded the departure of French forces. The country's leaders argued that French intervention had been ineffective in maintaining security and expressed interest in exploring new security partnerships. Recently, Niger has kicked out the United States forces, and Chad is also hinting at doing the same. This trend has reinforced an increasing cooperation with non-Western powers like China, Russia, and Turkey, who have taken advantage of this shift to influence the geopolitics in Africa. But with all that said, the question is, will the West be willing to look on from the outside? Or are we heading for some power play on the African continent?